Red Canyon, Arizona, September 1882. The stagecoach arrived 40 minutes late, which was not unusual for that stretch of desert road in early autumn, when the heat still pressed down hard enough to warp the air above the flats and make the horizon shimmer like something half imagined. The driver said nothing by way of apology. He simply pulled the horses to a stop at the platform edge, climbed down from his seat with the stiffness of a man who had been folded into the same position for 6 hours, and began unloading luggage without looking at his passengers. Eleanor Marsh stepped down onto the platform of Red Canyon, Arizona, and stood still for a moment. She was 31 years old. She was wearing a dress of dark gray wool that had been pressed carefully the night before, and had lost most of that precision over the course of the journey. Her hair was pinned correctly. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her spine was straight in the particular way of a woman who had learned, early and permanently, that posture was the one thing no one could take from you without your permission. She looked at the town. Red Canyon was not what she had imagined, though she had been careful not to imagine too specifically. A main street of dry-packed earth, a hardware store, a dry goods, a post office with its flag hanging limp in the still air, a church at the far end with white paint peeling from its clapboard sides, buildings the color of old bone, bleached by a sun that did not appear to make exceptions. She had come from Boston. Not the Boston of cobblestone streets and gas lamps and the particular smell of the harbor in early morning, though she had known all of those things. She had come from the Boston of scholarship halls and drafty classrooms, and the particular loneliness of a woman who knew too much to be comfortable and not enough of the right things to be safe. She had come from a city where her education was simultaneously her greatest achievement and her most inconvenient quality, depending on who was doing the accounting. Her parents had died within 8 months of each other when she was 19. First her father, then her mother, as though one had simply decided not to remain without the other. Eleanor had inherited their small apartment, their smaller savings, and a library of 400 books that she had eventually been forced to sell, one shelf at a time, to pay for her final year of studies at the Boston Ladies' Academy. She kept 43 volumes. Those 43 volumes were in the trunk at her feet. She had graduated with a degree in classical literature and secondary certificates in mathematics and natural science. She had taught for 3 years at a school in the South End, where the girls came from families who could barely afford the modest fees and who needed every advantage they could carry out the door with them. She had been good at it. She had been, if she was honest with herself, very good at it. And then the school had closed. Funding withdrawn. Building sold. Children scattered back to whatever arrangements their families could manage. Eleanor had stood in the empty classroom on the last day and looked at the rows of desks and felt something she did not have a precise word for. Not grief, exactly. More like the particular desolation of watching something necessary disappear. She had answered the advertisement 3 months later. A widower in Arizona Territory, established ranch, seeking a wife of practical temperament and Christian character. References required. Serious inquiries only. She had written a serious inquiry. She had enclosed her references. She had listed, honestly, her qualifications, her education, her situation. She had been, as she was in most things, direct to the point of imprudence. Warren Holt had written back. They had corresponded for 4 months. His letters were short and plain and said what they meant. He had seemed, from those letters, like a man who could be reasoned with. A man of decent instincts and modest expectations. She had been wrong about the expectations. The first day was unremarkable. Warren showed her the ranch house, which was small but manageable, and the land, which was dry but workable, and spoke with the careful politeness of a man trying to make a good impression. He smiled when he met her at the platform. He carried her trunk without being asked. He said, "Miss Marsh, you are a welcome sight." And she had felt something careful and small flutter in her chest, the beginning of something she had not let herself have in a long time. That flutter lasted exactly 3 days. On the second day, he found her at the kitchen table before dawn. She had been awake since 4:30, unable to sleep in the unfamiliar silence of the desert night, and she had taken out one of her books and her fountain pen and been reading and making notes in the margins by the light of the oil lamp. It was her third book since arriving. She did not think this was unusual. She thought, in the way of someone who has always lived inside her own habits, that reading before dawn was simply what one did. Warren had stood in the doorway and looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. Then he had gone back to bed. But the smile, when it returned at breakfast, was thinner than it had been. On the third day, she made the mistake. He was talking about what he owed the feed store in town, $37 and some change, and he had arrived at the total by a method that produced the wrong answer by nearly $6. She had not meant to embarrass him. She had simply, in the automatic way of someone for whom numbers were a reflex, said, "I believe that is closer to 43, and turned over the back of an envelope and shown him how she had arrived there. He had stared at the envelope. Then he had pushed back from the table and gone to bed without another word. In the morning, he told her to gather her things. He stood in the parlor with his hat in both hands, and his jaw set, and his eyes on the floor when he said it. And Eleanor stood across from him with her spine locked in that careful vertical line and her hands perfectly still at her sides, and she waited for him to look at her. He did not look at her for a long time. "You are too educated," he said. He said it like a diagnosis, like a condition that had been confirmed after careful examination and found to be terminal. "I sent for a wife," he said, "not a schoolmarm. A woman who knows more than her husband does not stay content. She starts thinking she deserves better." Eleanor said nothing. "Maybe she does," he continued. His voice had gone quieter. "But I cannot live with that feeling, Miss Marsh. I cannot build a life next to it." She wanted to argue. She had the arguments ready, several of them, arranged in order of increasing precision. She was not a woman who was caught unprepared. She had been preparing for conversations like this one her entire life. Conversations where someone told her that what she was constituted a problem, and she had learned to have her responses organized before the other person had finished speaking. But she looked at Warren Holt's face, and she understood something that made the arguments feel useless. This was not a debate. This was a man who had already decided, and who had come to this room not to be persuaded, but to deliver a verdict he had written the night before, while she was sleeping. "Then I will go," she said, and she meant it. She meant it not as a performance of dignity, not as a bluff designed to make him reconsider, but as a simple statement of what would happen next. She would go. She would gather her things. She would carry her trunk back to the platform, and she would find another way, because there was always another way. And she had been finding other ways since she was 19 years old, and there was no one left to find them for her. She went. The platform of Red Canyon was not a place built for the accommodation of difficult moments. It was a single narrow stretch of warped boards with a bench that listed slightly to one side, and a painted sign so weathered by the Arizona sun that the letters had become suggestions rather than facts. A window at one end where the station master operated behind thick glass, his eyes making their careful, sideways observations. Eleanor sat on the bench with her trunk at her feet and her smallest book open in her lap. She had not read a word of it in 20 minutes. She was aware of this fact without being able to correct it. The words sat on the page in their proper arrangement and declined to assemble into meaning. The town had already heard. She could feel it in the way the station master kept finding reasons to glance through his window. In the way two women on the far side of the street had slowed their walking and bent their heads together. In Red Canyon, as in every small place she had ever encountered, news of a woman's humiliation traveled faster than the woman herself. She pressed her fingernails into her palm, not hard enough to mark, just enough to have something to press against. She would not cry here. She had made that decision before she sat down, made it with the same matter-of-fact efficiency with which she made most decisions. She would not give the station windows and the slow-walking women anything they could carry home with them. The next train was not until morning. She had enough money for a night at the boarding house if the rates were reasonable. She had a cousin in Philadelphia who would take her in, but the cousin's hospitality came wrapped in the particular kind of pity that cost more to accept than it saved. Eleanor was not ready to pay that cost. She was not ready to admit that this had been foolish. She was not ready to go backward. She was still looking at the unread page when she became aware of a presence to her left. Not the intrusive kind of presence, not the kind that announced itself and demanded acknowledgement, the quiet kind, the kind that had been there for a moment already without pressing the fact. She turned her head. The man was standing at the far edge of the platform, leaning against the post with his arms folded in the easy way of someone who was accustomed to waiting and had no particular objection to it. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, wearing a hat with a dark band that had been through some weather and boots that had been through considerably more. His eyes, when they met hers across the platform, were an unexpected shade of green, the kind of green you did not anticipate finding in a landscape this overwhelmingly brown. And they were not doing what most eyes did in situations like this one. They were not cataloging her difficulty with interest. They were not composing pity. They were simply looking, steadily and without demand. "That trunk looks heavy," he said, "for a woman sitting alone." "I managed it on the train," Eleanor said. "I don't doubt it." He tilted his head toward the trunk. "You want me to move it off the platform for you? The corner is digging into your shin." She looked down. The corner of the trunk was indeed pressing into her shin. She had not noticed it until he pointed it out, which meant she had been sitting with it for some time, absorbing the discomfort without registering it, which was, she recognized, something she did with a great many things. "Thank you," she said. "That would be kind." He moved the trunk without straining, set it flat against the post, and straightened. He did not sit down next to her. He did not press conversation. He simply stood where he was and looked out at the street, settled into his own silence with the ease of a man who did not require noise to feel comfortable in a space. She watched him for a moment with the assessing habit she had developed over years of reading people the way she read texts, looking for the structure beneath the surface. "You know who I am," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, ma'am. And you know what happened. I know what people are saying happened." He glanced at her sideways, unhurried. That is not always the same thing. Eleanor felt something in her chest shift very slightly, the way a hand unclenches one finger at a time. "Warren Holt sent me back," she said, "because I hold a degree from the Boston Ladies' Academy and did not hide it sufficiently." She paused. "That is what happened." The man nodded once, slowly, the way someone nods when they are confirming a thing they had already understood. "Jasper is a decent man with small ideas." He said it without contempt. "The way you might describe the weather. That combination does not fare well with an educated woman." She looked at him. "You seem very certain of that." "I know Warren." He turned to face her then, and he pulled his hat off and held it in both hands, which she would come to understand was something he did when he was about to say something that mattered. Caleb Harrow. He said his name plainly, without decoration. "I run a spread about 4 miles north of here. I came to town for feed and herd." He stopped, looked at her directly. "Are you all right, Miss Marsh?" The question was so straightforwardly sincere that it nearly undid her. She had been braced for pity, which was sympathy, wearing a costume it did not quite fit. She had been braced for curiosity, dressed up as concern. She had not been prepared for a question that simply wanted to know the answer. "I am determining that," she said carefully. He nodded as though this was a sensible response, which she supposed it was. "Where are you headed?" "I do not know yet." "Do you have people back east?" "A cousin in Philadelphia." She stopped. "But I do not want charity. And I am not willing to admit that coming here was a mistake, and I am not ready to make myself smaller to fit into a space someone else decided was appropriate for me." She did not say any of that. "I have options," she finished. "Sure." He turned the hat in his hands. "I have a question for you, Miss Marsh." He paused. "I am asking it plain and with no bad intention." She looked at him steadily. "Ask it. Can you read?" The question startled a laugh out of her. The first real thing she had felt in hours, rising up before she could think to stop it. Warm and involuntary. "Can I read?" she said. "Mr. Harrow, I hold a degree in classical literature with secondary certificates in mathematics and natural science. I have read more books than most men in this territory have seen." "Good." His jaw shifted in the way she would later come to recognize as the expression he made when he was working through something he had not yet found the words for. "Because I cannot. Not a word. I know my numbers well enough to run a ranch and avoid being cheated too badly. But letters, no. I never learned." She was quiet. This was not the response she had expected, and Eleanor Marsh was not accustomed to being placed in positions she had not anticipated. He met her eyes without flinching. The admission had cost him something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the particular steadiness of a man who was holding himself carefully around a thing that was not easy to hold. He did not look ashamed, precisely. He looked like a man who had carried a truth for a long time, and had decided, in this moment and for his own reasons, to set it down in front of her. "I have been running this ranch for 11 years, he said. "It grows. Contracts come in that I cannot read for myself. I have been trusting other people's word on what the papers say, and a man ought to be able to read what he signs." He held her gaze. "I would like to learn." Eleanor considered him. "I have a spare room," he continued. "A full larder. More work than I can do alone. If you are willing to teach me, reading, writing, whatever else you think a man in my position ought to know, I will pay you a fair wage and give you room and board for as long as the lessons take." He paused. No other expectations. The platform boards were warm under her feet. Somewhere down the street, a horse shifted in its hitching, and a cart went past carrying something that rattled. The station master's clock ticked behind its window. The two women on the far side of the street had moved on. "You are serious," Eleanor said. "Miss Marsh, I do not spend much time saying things I do not mean." She looked at him the way she looked at difficult texts, not for the surface of the thing, but for what was underneath it. What she found was a man who was genuinely embarrassed by his illiteracy and honest enough not to conceal that embarrassment behind a pretense of indifference. A man who had moved her trunk without ceremony and then offered her something real in the most direct language available to him. A man with steady hands and green eyes and a quality of stillness that did not come from emptiness. It came from depth. "There will be talk," she said. "There is already talk." He said it practically, without apology. "That particular horse has left the barn." She almost smiled. "You are not wrong. I have a housekeeper, a woman named Winifred Briggs, who comes 3 days a week. She can serve as a chaperone, if that is a concern. The room has a lock. You would have full use of the parlor and the front porch." He stopped. "I would ask nothing of you but honesty. If you think I am a hopeless student, you tell me. If the arrangement stops suiting you, you tell me that as well." "And what do you ask for yourself?" she said, not professionally. "For yourself." The question appeared to catch him somewhere he had not expected to be caught. He was quiet for a moment, turning the hat slowly in both hands, and she watched him think in the particular way he thought, without performance, without the anxious fill of unnecessary words. "Teach me everything," he said. "Whatever you think a man ought to know. I am not particular about where you start." The silence after that had a different quality than the ones before it. It was not empty. It was the kind of silence that contains a decision in the process of being made. Eleanor looked at the man in front of her, at his battered hat and his unreasonable eyes, and the way he had told her something humiliating about himself with the same levelness with which he might have described the weather, and she thought about Philadelphia and her cousin's lace curtains and the careful shrinking that would be required of her to fit inside that particular version of rescue. "Yes," she said. She did not say it quickly. She sat with it for long enough that a lesser man would have tried to fill the space with more persuasion, with sweetening, with the kind of pressure that disguises itself as patience. Caleb Harrow did not fill the space. He simply waited, hat in hand, with the complete and undemanding stillness of a man who had made an honest offer and was prepared to hear whatever answer came. When she finally said yes, something moved through his face that was not triumph and was not relief, and was not quite either of those things. It was quieter than both. The expression of a man who had trusted his own judgment and found out, without fanfare, that he had been right. He lifted her trunk into the wagon without asking. She climbed up without help. They drove out of Red Canyon in the long, flat gold of the afternoon sun, and neither of them spoke much, because there was not much yet that needed saying. Winifred Briggs met Eleanor at the door of the ranch house with the expression of a woman who had seen the full range of human behavior over the course of 60 years and had formed precise opinions about most of it. She was compact and iron-haired, and her eyes moved quickly. She looked at Eleanor the way a person looks at a letter whose contents they have not yet read, but about whose general subject they have already been informed. "This is Miss Eleanor Marsh," Caleb said. "She will be staying in the East Room. She is going to be teaching me to read." Winifred looked at Eleanor for a moment. Then she looked at Caleb. Then she looked back at Eleanor with the expression of a woman completing a calculation. "You are the one Warren Holt sent back," she said. "I am," Eleanor said. A pause. The kind of pause that is actually a decision. "I always thought Warren was a fool," Winifred said. "Come in. There is soup on." Eleanor carried her own trunk to the east room and set it against the wall and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment in the quiet of the desert evening. Through the window, the sky was going the color of embers, deep orange at the horizon, fading upward into a blue so pure it hurt to look at directly. A single hawk moved across the far edge of it, riding something she could not see. She opened her trunk. She took out the primer she had carried from Boston, a simple thing with round letters and short words, the kind she had used with her youngest students in the South End. She turned it over in her hands. It was worn at the corners from years of being handed between small fingers, and there was a water stain on the back cover from the winter she had walked home through sleet with it tucked under her arm. She thought about what it meant to have come 3,000 miles and ended the day not on a train back east, but in a room with a lock and a view of a hawk and a job to do. She thought about what it meant that the thing standing between her and destitution was 43 books and the ability to read them. She placed the primer on the table beside the bed. She washed her face at the basin. She went to supper, which was soup and bread and sparse, practical conversation, and afterward she went back to her room and locked the door and lay in the dark and listened to the desert, which had a sound she had not expected, vast and low and full of things too far away to identify. She was not content. She was not safe. She had no guarantee that this arrangement would hold, or that the man who had made it would prove to be what he appeared. She had been wrong about such things before, and the cost of being wrong had not been abstract. But she was not going backward, and that, for the moment, was enough. The first lesson began the following morning, before the heat of the day had properly committed itself, when the kitchen still held the cool of the night, and the light coming through the east window was pale and unhurried. Eleanor had been awake since before dawn. She had gone through her trunk in the small hours, not from restlessness exactly, but from the particular alertness of a woman who was beginning something and wanted to begin it correctly. She had found the primer and set it on the table. She had found her fountain pen and her bottle of ink, and a fresh sheet of paper she intended for practice letters. She had arranged these things with the care of someone who understood that the physical order of a workspace was not vanity, but preparation, that a student noticed whether their teacher had thought ahead, and that the answer to that question told them something about whether they were worth thinking ahead for. Caleb came in from the yard at 6:30. He poured his own coffee, stood at the window for a moment looking at something outside that Eleanor could not see, and then turned and looked at the table, at the primer and the pen and the paper arranged in their careful order, and sat down across from her without saying anything. She had wondered if he would bristle at the primer. It was a child's book. There was no disguising what it was, with its large round letters and its short declarative sentences and its illustrations of animals and household objects. She had taught with it for 3 years, and she knew its particular capacity to humble a person who had expected something more dignified. He looked at it for a moment. "All right," he said. "Show me." "We will start with the alphabet," Eleanor said. "I know that sounds basic." "That is where you start," he said. He looked at her directly. "Miss Marsh, I did not hire you to make me comfortable. I hired you to teach me. Start where you need to start." She had taught girls from good families who had no interest in learning, and girls from poor families who were desperately interested, and one extraordinary girl of 12 who had read an entire novel in a single sitting and wept at the ending. She had never taught a grown man. She had expected it to be harder in some ways and easier in others, and had prepared herself for both. She had not expected this. Caleb Harrow did not learn the way children learned, in fits and starts, with detours into distraction and the need for encouragement at regular intervals. He learned the way a man learned something he had needed for a very long time, and was quietly furious at himself for not having sooner. He wrote each letter 5 times before she asked him to. When he got one wrong, he did not look to her for confirmation of the error. He looked at it himself, pressed his lips together, and corrected it, and moved on without comment. By the end of the first hour, he could identify every letter of the alphabet. By the end of the second, he could write them all, slowly and with considerable effort, but accurately. At the end of the morning, he wrote his own name on a clean sheet of paper, Caleb Harrow, in letters that were large and slightly uneven and unmistakably real. He looked at it for a long moment. She could not see his face from where she sat, but she could see the quality of his stillness, the way he held himself around the thing he was looking at. He turned the paper face down on the table. "What is next?" he said. Outside, a hawk was riding the thermals above the far pasture, the same species Eleanor had watched through her window the night before, or perhaps a different one. She was learning that there were always hawks in this country. They were as ordinary here as sparrows had been in Boston, and yet she found she could not stop watching them. She taught him letters, then words, then short sentences of the kind a 9-year-old would be given on a Wednesday afternoon in a schoolroom that smelled of chalk and damp wool coats. She had wondered whether the simplicity would discourage him. It did not. He attacked the simple sentences with the same focused concentration he had brought to the alphabet, as though the difficulty of the material was beside the point, and the point was the mastery of it, whatever it happened to be. At the end of the 3rd day, she caught him practicing in the evenings. She had not suggested this. She had not assigned it. She had gone to the kitchen, late for a glass of water, and found him at the table alone. The lamp turned low. A sheet of paper in front of him covered in words he was copying from the primer. He did not startle when she came in. He simply looked up. "I learn better if I do it again at night," he said, "before I sleep." She got her water and went back to her room and lay in the dark and thought about a man who had been signing his name with an X for 34 years and who was now practicing his letters alone by lamplight because he learned better that way. She thought about that for quite a while. It was on the 4th morning that she first saw the girl. Eleanor had been watching from the kitchen window while Caleb worked on a section of fence along the south pasture, and she had noticed a small figure standing at the far edge of the property line, just outside the boundary of the ranch. A child of perhaps 9, in a dress that had been let down twice at the hem and was still too short, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that had come half loose. She was not doing anything in particular. She was simply standing there, watching, with the quality of attention that Eleanor recognized as hunger, though not the kind that had anything to do with food. She mentioned it to Winifred that afternoon. "That is Delia," Winifred said, without looking up from the bread she was shaping. "Her father runs cattle on the Coleridge spread, 3 miles east. Good man. The mother passed 2 years back." She stopped. "Delia walks past here most mornings on her way to nowhere in particular. Does she go to school?" Eleanor asked. "Nearest school is 12 miles. Winifred said. "The family cannot manage the distance." Eleanor went back to the window. The girl was gone. But the next morning she was there again, standing at the same spot with the same quality of focused, hungry watching. And Eleanor walked out to the fence line and said, simply and without prelude, "Do you want to come in and learn some things?" Delia looked at her for a moment with the careful assessment of a child who has learned not to expect much from offers. "What kind of things?" she said. "Reading," Eleanor said. "Writing. Whatever else seems useful." Delia came in. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the primer with the same expression Caleb had worn on the first morning, and Eleanor thought, not for the first time, that hunger looked the same regardless of the face wearing it. Caleb saw them from the yard. He came past the kitchen window twice during the lesson, not stopping, not lingering. But Eleanor noticed the second pass and understood that he had already noticed on the first. That evening she found a small wooden stool placed against the fence post nearest where Delia usually stood. It had not been there before. Caleb did not mention it. Eleanor did not ask. She mentioned it to no one. It was not the kind of thing that needed to be said aloud. The talk reached them on the 12th day. It came first through Winifred, who delivered information the way she delivered most things, without embellishment or apology, as a simple account of what was true. Warren Holt had been in the dry goods store on Thursday. He had told the Billings family that the arrangement at the Harrow ranch was irregular. He had used the word unsuitable more than once. He had implied, without stating directly, that a woman of Eleanor's situation had made a series of choices that reflected poorly on her judgment. Eleanor listened to this account with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and her expression neutral. "What did he say exactly?" she asked. "That an educated woman living under a bachelor's roof without the sanction of marriage was the kind of thing that gave the community something to talk about." Winifred's voice was flat and precise. He was not saying it quietly. Eleanor thought about Warren Holt's face on the morning he had told her to gather her things, the particular quality of his discomfort, the way his eyes had stayed on the floor. She thought about what it meant that a man could make a decision that diminished someone else and then require that person to be diminished by it in order for the decision to feel justified. "She is aware," she said to Winifred, meaning herself. She set down her cup. "I am being paid a fair wage for legitimate work in a room with a lock. I have been treated worse for less." Winifred looked at her for a moment with the evaluating expression Eleanor was beginning to understand was her way of determining whether something was worth saying. "He is a decent man with small ideas," Winifred said, which is its own kind of problem, because decent men with small ideas are harder to argue with than dishonest ones. They believe what they are saying. Eleanor picked up her book. "That," she said, "does not make them right." Warren Holt came to the ranch himself on the 14th day. Eleanor was on the front porch with a volume of territorial history she had borrowed from the small lending shelf at the dry goods store, and she heard the horse before she saw it, and then she saw it, and on it, Warren, sitting straight-backed in his good hat with the expression of a man who had rehearsed what he intended to say and was not entirely confident in the material. Caleb had come around from the side of the house at the sound of the horse, and he stopped about 10 feet from the porch steps. He was holding a length of fence post in one hand, not as a threat, simply because that was what he had been working with. He set it down against the porch railing and stood with his arms loose at his sides and his eyes on Warren and his expression giving away nothing at all. "Warren," Caleb said. "Caleb." Warren's eyes moved to Eleanor. "Miss Marsh." He stopped. I heard you were staying here." "You heard correctly," Eleanor said. He turned his hat in his hands. "I may have been." He stopped. "Hasty in my decision." "You may have been," Eleanor said. The porch was quiet. Somewhere off in the direction of the south pasture, a coyote made its brief, testing sound and went silent. "A man wants to feel useful to his wife," Warren said. "He wants to feel that he is needed." He looked at her with those flat, careful eyes. "I was not sure I would feel that way with a woman who knows things." Eleanor kept her voice even. "Warren, you sent me away because I corrected an arithmetic error. If that made you feel threatened, I am sorry. But I will not apologize for the arithmetic, and I will not apologize for what I know." He sat with that for a moment. "No," he said at last. "I do not suppose you should." His eyes moved to Caleb, to the man who was standing still and watching with the fence post now leaning against the railing and those green eyes that had not moved from Warren's face since he rode up. Something shifted in Warren's expression, the particular flatness of a man who had come hoping to find one thing and had found another. "Is this?" he said. He stopped. "Are you and Caleb?" "I am his teacher," Eleanor said. "He is my employer. That is what we are." Warren nodded slowly. Something in his face went the way of a room when all the windows close at once. She understood that he had come here, at least in part, hoping to find her diminished, hoping the choice she had made would have produced the outcome he had privately predicted. A woman humbled by her own decisions, grateful for whatever revised offer he might be bringing. He had found instead a woman on a porch with a book under her arm and no particular interest in revising anything. "Good evening, Warren," Eleanor said. He put his hat back on. He turned his horse. He rode back toward Red Canyon without looking back, and the sound of his horse on the packed earth faded until the desert absorbed it entirely. Caleb stood at the foot of the porch steps and did not say anything for a moment. Eleanor opened her book and found her page, though the light was going too flat for comfortable reading. "He did not deserve you," Caleb said. He said it quietly and without decoration, the way he said most things, as though the words had been weighed before being released and found to be exactly sufficient, and no more than that. Eleanor turned a page she had not read. She could feel him looking at her with that particular quality of attention he had, the kind that did not press or demand, but was simply, completely present. "Go work on your fence, Mr. Harrow," she said. He went. But neither of them was quite the same after that, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the east room with the window cracked and the desert making its vast and indifferent sounds around the house, and she told herself she was thinking about the next lesson, about the compound words she intended to introduce and the reading exercise she had planned from a page of territorial notices she had found in the dry goods store, practical material, the kind a man running a ranch would actually encounter. She told herself several things. None of them were entirely true, and she knew it. She was thinking about 7 words. "He did not deserve you," said quietly. Said without an audience in mind, without the performance of comfort, said the way Caleb Harrow said everything, as though the truth of something was the most natural reason in the world to say it. She was a woman of education and reason. She did not unravel over 7 words from a man she had known less than 3 weeks. She told herself that with some firmness and lay looking at the ceiling and did not sleep for quite some time. The following morning was the morning Winifred told her about the contract. She came in at mid-morning on a Thursday and found Eleanor alone in the parlor reviewing the pages of practice sentences Caleb had written the previous evening. He had begun doing this without being asked, filling pages in the evenings with sentences about the ranch, about things he had observed, about what the cattle were doing and what the fence needed, and once, in careful, uneven letters, a sentence about the quality of the light over the eastern pasture at dusk that made Eleanor sit very still for a moment before turning the page. Winifred set down her basket and said, without introduction, "There is a man coming from the land office in Tucson next week. Something about a contract for water rights on the north pasture." Eleanor set down the practice pages. Caleb mentioned water rights. Briefly. Briefly is how he mentions things that concern him, Winifred said. She sat down across from Eleanor with the deliberate movement of a woman who intended to say something and had decided the time for it was now. Last year, he signed a contract with a feed supplier that he could not read for himself. He trusted the man's word on what it said. He ended up paying nearly double what he had agreed to verbally. It cost him close to a third of his savings. Eleanor went still. The man who drew up that contract knew Caleb could not read the document, Winifred said. Caleb knew the man knew. And he signed it because what choice did he have? She looked at Eleanor steadily. The water rights on the north pasture are worth considerably more than that feed agreement. And the man from the land office, his name is Aldous Crane. He has a reputation for finding ways to benefit himself in the language of a document that a man without legal training might not notice. Eleanor looked down at the practice pages in her lap, at the sentences Caleb had written alone at the kitchen table in the lamplight, the letters still occasionally falling backward or stacking unevenly, but real and recognizable and entirely his. "How long until Crane arrives?" she said. 7 days, Winifred said. "Give or take, 7 days." Eleanor sat with the arithmetic of that for a moment. 7 days to bring a man who had been learning his letters for 2 weeks to a place where he could read a legal document carefully enough to identify language that had been designed not to be identified. The mathematics were not favorable. She had done unfavorable mathematics before. Unfavorable was not the same as impossible. She closed the folder of practice pages and stood up. "Tell Caleb I need 2 hours with him this afternoon instead of 1, she said, "and every afternoon between now and next week." Winifred looked at her with an expression Eleanor could not entirely read, something that sat between approval and something older and warmer, something that had more to do with recognition than assessment. "All right," Winifred said. She told Caleb herself that afternoon when he came to the kitchen table. He went quiet in the way she had begun to recognize, the quiet of a man processing something he would prefer not to show on his face. "You did not have to do that," he said. "Talk to Winifred first. You could have told me directly. I am telling you now." Eleanor sat down across from him. "And I did not tell her to push the lessons. I told her because she should know my schedule has changed." He looked at the table. "I appreciate the intention, but I know where I am. I cannot read a legal contract in 7 days." "You cannot read one today?" Eleanor said. "That is different from what you will be able to do in 7 days with the right preparation." He was quiet. "Caleb." She said his name without the Mr. in front of it for the first time, and she felt him register it, though he kept his face still. "I know about the feed contract. Last year, the quality of the silence changed. It acquired an edge. Winifred told you," he said. "She did. Not because I asked. Because she is worried about you, and because she knew you would not bring it up yourself. His jaw was working slightly. She could see the cold, settled anger of a man who knew exactly how something had happened and exactly how it could have been prevented, and who had been living with that knowledge for over a year. "I can get you to the point where you can read a contract sentence by sentence," Eleanor said, "where you can hear the difference between what you were told it would say and what it actually says. That is enough. That is what you need." He was looking at her now, directly, with the full weight of his attention, the way he sometimes looked at her without apology for the looking. "Why does this matter to you?" he said, not with suspicion, genuinely asking. She opened her mouth and nearly said something professionally appropriate, something about her commitment to her work, about wanting her student to succeed, about the principle of a contract being what it claims to be. All of it true, none of it complete. "Because you trusted me with something real," she said instead, "and I do not take that lightly." The silence that followed was different in shape from all the ones before it. Caleb looked at his hands on the table, then back at her. 2 hours a day, he said. "Starting now." "Starting now," Eleanor agreed. What followed were 7 days unlike anything that had come before them in that kitchen. She pushed him harder than she had pushed any student. She brought the compound sentences she had planned and moved through them faster than she had intended, not because he was struggling, but because he was not. Because he was absorbing the structure of written language with the focused hunger of a man who understood, at a level that had nothing to do with grammar, exactly what was at stake. On the 4th day, she placed a document on the table in front of him, not the real contract, which she did not have, but a replica she had constructed based on her knowledge of how such documents were typically written, with traps deliberately embedded in the language, clauses that contradicted each other, conditions buried in dependent phrases, rights that appeared to be granted in one paragraph and quietly qualified out of existence in the next. "Read it," she said. "Flag anything that does not seem right." He was silent for a long time. She watched his eyes move across the lines, slower than she would have liked, careful and deliberate, the movement of a man who was not yet fast enough to let reading feel like water, but who was no longer drowning in it. He reached the 3rd paragraph and stopped. "This says the water rights transfer upon completion of payment," he said. He read it again to make sure he had it right. Then he moved further down the page and pointed to a clause she had buried in the second to last section. "But this says the rights are subject to annual review. Those two things do not match. One says I own it when I pay. The other says someone can revisit the terms every year." Eleanor looked at him. "That is right," she said quietly. He looked up. Something moved through his face that she had not seen there before, a recognition so specific and so personal that she felt she was witnessing something he had not intended to show. "That is what happened with the feed contract," he said. "Something like that. Very likely." He sat back in his chair and was quiet, and she could see the cold anger moving through him, the particular kind that had nowhere to go because the time for it had already passed, and so it simply sat in a man and became part of the structure of him. "All right," he said after a moment. "What else did you put in there?" Eleanor looked at him across the kitchen table, at this man who had built a working ranch from desert ground with nothing but competence and stubbornness and 11 years of hard labor, who had been made a fool of by a piece of paper and had never told anyone how much that had cost him. She thought about a man sitting alone at a kitchen table with his practice letters and the lamp turned low. "Find it yourself," she said. He found 2 more. By the time Aldous Crane arrived on Tuesday morning, driving a hired buggy from town with a leather document case on the seat beside him, Caleb Harrow had spent 7 days learning to read legal language the way a man learns to read weather, not by memorizing every variation, but by understanding the patterns that predict trouble. Crane was a man whose face had learned early to be pleasant, regardless of what the rest of him was doing. He shook Caleb's hand with both of his and set his document case on the parlor table, and said he was sure they could have everything settled well before supper. Eleanor was introduced, after a brief pause, as Caleb's associate. Crane looked at her and filed something away behind his pleasant eyes. "I was not aware you had an associate," he said. "I have several," Caleb said. "Miss Marsh handles documents." Another pause, barely a beat, but present. "Of course," Crane said. He produced the contract from his case. "It is fairly standard," he said. "The terms we discussed in our last correspondence." Caleb picked it up. He read it. He read it the way Eleanor had taught him, working through each section without rushing, without apology for the time it took. She sat beside him and said nothing. Crane maintained his pleasant expression across the table and waited. Caleb reached the 3rd page. He set the contract down and turned it between himself and Crane and pointed to the relevant clause with one finger. "This says the rights are subject to annual review by the land office," he said. "That was not what we discussed. What we discussed was a permanent transfer. This is a lease dressed up as a sale." Crane's pleasant face did something complicated. "That is a standard provision, Mr. Harrow. It simply means—" "I know what it means," Caleb said. "It means you can revisit the terms every year, which means what I am signing today is not permanent." He looked at Crane directly. "That is not what we agreed to." The room was quiet. Through the window, the desert sat in its bright, indifferent stillness. "There may have been a drafting error," Crane said carefully. "May have been," Caleb said. "You will correct it here. Miss Marsh will draft the corrected language, and we will have it signed today. Or we schedule a new meeting with a lawyer present from Tucson. Your choice." A silence. "Today works fine," Crane said. After Crane left with his corrected contract and his noticeably reduced confidence, Caleb stood in the parlor and did not say anything for a long moment. Winifred materialized from the direction of the kitchen with the particular timing of a woman who had been waiting for the right moment, said she would put on coffee, and disappeared again. Eleanor began gathering the papers from the table. She was aware of Caleb standing very still about 4 feet from her, and she was aware of the particular weight of that stillness, and she kept her attention on the papers. "Caleb," she said, without looking up. He said nothing. "Caleb," she said again, and this time she looked up. His jaw was working in the way it did when he was arriving at something he did not quite have the language for yet. "I have been running this ranch for 11 years, he said. "I have made it work." He paused. "I have also signed things I did not understand and trusted men I should not have trusted, and told myself it did not matter because I had enough practical sense to compensate for what I lacked." He looked at her. "It mattered." "Yes," she said. "What you did this week." He stopped. Started again. "I do not have the right word for it yet." "You have more words than you did 2 weeks ago," she said. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory. He said, slowly and with the care of a man selecting precisely the right thing from a larger collection, "Significant. What you did was significant." She held his gaze for a moment. The afternoon light was coming through the parlor window, and the coffee smell was drifting from the kitchen, and outside the desert was conducting its usual business of being enormous and unhurried and completely unconcerned with the small human matters occurring within it. "You are a fast learner, Mr. Harrow," she said. "You are a good teacher, Miss Marsh." He paused. "Are you going to call me Mr. Harrow for the rest of your natural life?" She looked at him for a beat. "Are you going to keep finding ways to make me proud of you?" He turned away, but not before she saw what crossed his face when she said it. She picked up her papers and went to find her coffee, and she allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel the thing she had been carefully not feeling for 2 weeks. Not contentment, not merely surviving. Something warmer and more inconvenient than either of those, solid and real and not going anywhere. And she had absolutely no idea yet what to do with it. The journal appeared on the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, 3 days after Aldous Crane had driven back toward town with his corrected contract and his recalibrated sense of what he was dealing with at the Harrow Ranch. It was a plain thing. Brown cover, no markings, the kind sold at the dry goods store alongside seed catalogs and account ledgers. The kind a man could leave in plain sight without it looking like a confession. Caleb had said nothing about starting it. He had simply begun, the way he had begun everything since the first lesson, without announcement, without asking permission, as though the decision had been made somewhere below the level of deliberation, and simply emerged into action. Eleanor saw it first by accident. She had come into the kitchen for water late in the evening, after the ranch had gone quiet and Winifred had gone home. And the only sounds were the desert settling into its nighttime register, that vast, low conversation of wind and distance that she had stopped finding unsettling and begun finding, without quite deciding to, something close to companionable. The journal was on the table, closed, with the pen laid across it at a slight angle. She would have left it there. She had every intention of leaving it there. But it had fallen open slightly at the back, the way new journals do when the pages have not yet found their permanent positions, and she could see the last written page from where she stood. She did not reach for it. She read it from where she was, at the distance the kitchen allowed. The handwriting was still uneven, the letters still occasionally falling backward or crowding each other at turns, but it had become, in the 2 weeks since the first lesson, recognizably his, with a forward lean and a particular way of forming the letter H that she had watched develop from nothing. He had written several sentences about the cattle and the state of the north fence and the quality of the weather, and then, at the bottom of the page, in slightly larger letters, as though he had needed more room for them, "A man can build everything he has with his own hands and still not know what he is missing until it walks up to find him at the train station." Eleanor stood at the counter with her glass of water and read the sentence twice. Then she set down the glass and left the kitchen without it. She did not sleep particularly well. The morning came in the way Arizona mornings came in October, with a quality of light that was different from September's, less fierce, longer in its angles, the kind of light that made the desert look like something that might, under the right conditions, forgive you. Eleanor came to the kitchen first and started the coffee and had the lesson materials arranged on the table by the time Caleb came in from checking the stock. He sat down, poured his coffee. Then, without being asked, he placed her cup in front of her before sitting. It was the first time he had done that. She did not mention it. She opened the primer to the compound sentences she had been building toward, and they began. and the lesson proceeded the way lessons between them proceeded now, with a quality of ease that was not the absence of difficulty, but something that had grown up alongside difficulty and learned to coexist with it. He asked questions she had not anticipated. He challenged her assumptions about grammar with the same levelness with which he challenged everything, not to be difficult, but because the question was genuinely present in him and he saw no reason not to ask it. She had been thinking about the sentence in the journal for 12 hours, and she had decided, with the clarity that sometimes came from a night of insufficient sleep, that it changed nothing practical and everything else, and that the appropriate response was to continue teaching him compound sentences. She was doing that when Winifred appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, without prelude, "There is something you should both know." She sat down with the deliberate movement of a woman who had information and intended to deliver it correctly. "Harriet Webb came to see me yesterday," Winifred said. Harriet ran the lending shelf at the dry goods store and knew, as Eleanor had already discovered, considerably more about the county than her modest position suggested. "She told me that Augusta Finch has been speaking to Reverend Cole several times now." She paused. "About the arrangement here." Eleanor kept her hands flat on the table. Augusta Finch was the kind of woman every small community produced and organized itself around, the woman whose opinion set the boundaries of what was considered acceptable, whose disapproval functioned less as personal feeling and more as institutional verdict. Eleanor had encountered her type in Boston. The specific flavor varied by geography, but the essential architecture was identical. "What is she saying?" Caleb said. His voice was even. "That the arrangement is irregular," Winifred said. "That a single woman living and working in the home of an unmarried man, regardless of intent, creates an appearance that is difficult for the community." She looked at Caleb directly. "Reverend Cole is going to come and speak to you about it, probably this week." Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then, with a flatness that was different from his usual quiet, he said, "Warren helped this along. It was not a question." "Warren has been talking," Winifred confirmed. "Yes?" Eleanor looked at her coffee cup. She thought about Warren Holt on his horse 3 days ago, riding away without looking back. She thought about what it meant that a man could send a woman away and then require her ongoing diminishment as proof that the sending had been justified. She reached for a fresh sheet of paper and picked up her pen. "What are you doing?" Winifred said. "Writing a letter to Augusta Finch," Eleanor said, "inviting her to come here for tea." The silence that followed had a particular texture. Caleb looked at her. Winifred looked at her. Eleanor continued writing. "You are inviting Augusta Finch," Caleb said. "I am inviting her to come and discuss her concerns in person rather than through Reverend Cole and church circles," Eleanor said. She sealed the letter and set it aside. "I will send it with the next writer into town." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he went through 3 expressions in succession that Eleanor had come to think of as diagnostic of how he was processing something unexpected. The first was simple surprise. The second was a concern he was deciding whether to voice. The third was the expression she privately thought of as the well, that is Eleanor expression, which contained within it a particular kind of exasperated admiration that he appeared to have no mechanism for concealing. "She will come here to make you feel small," he said. "She will come here and find out what she is dealing with," Eleanor said. "Then we will see." She sent the letter. It was the evening of the day the letter was sent that Caleb found Eleanor still at the kitchen table after 10 o'clock, bent over a document with her pen, moving in the small, precise way it moved when she was working at something that required concentration. She did not hear him come in from outside. She was aware of him only when his shadow fell across the table, and she looked up to find him standing in the doorway, still wearing his coat, looking at her with an expression she could not immediately name. "It is cold out," she said, because something needed to be said. "It is," he agreed. He did not move for a moment. He looked at the table, at the papers and the lamp and the pen, and then he looked at her. And whatever he had been thinking about outside in the cold desert dark appeared to be still with him. Then he walked to the wooden chest in the corner of the room. Eleanor had noticed the chest before, without thinking about it particularly, the kind of piece of furniture that organizes itself into the background of a room. He opened it and took something out, and she looked up from her work properly for the first time. It was a shawl, woolen, deep green, the color of creek water in August, carefully folded, old but not worn through. The kind of thing that had been looked after. He crossed the kitchen and placed it over her shoulders. Not around her, not wrapped, just laid across. The gesture of someone who has performed a simple practical act without calculation. He stepped back. Eleanor sat very still. She had not realized she was cold until the warmth of the wool settled over her. She had not realized she had been holding herself against a chill she had stopped registering. She heard him moving to pour himself water. She heard him set the glass down. She did not turn around. "Whose is this?" she said. The pause before his answer was 4 seconds. She counted them without meaning to. "It belonged to Sarah," he said. His voice was the same, level and plain. He said it the way he said things that cost him something, not by changing the sound of them, but by making them very exact, each word placed with the care of something that could not be mishandled. Eleanor looked down at the papers in front of her. The ink on the page was still damp in one place where she had written quickly. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not be either too much or too little, and she had learned in the week since she had come to this ranch that Caleb Harrow understood the difference between a silence that was empty and a silence that was holding something carefully. She kept working. He finished his water and went to bed. The shawl stayed on her shoulders until the lamp burned low. Winifred arrived in the morning and saw it on the back of Eleanor's chair, where Eleanor had folded it before breakfast. Winifred looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Eleanor. "Sarah," Eleanor said quietly. Winifred turned back to the bread she was preparing. "Yes," she said. She was quiet for a moment. "He has not taken that out of the chest in 4 years." Eleanor picked up the shawl and folded it more precisely and set it on the corner of the table where Caleb would see it when he came in. She did not know what she intended by that. She thought, perhaps, that some things did not need to be acted on immediately. Some things needed only to be acknowledged, set down in a visible place, and allowed to be whatever they were going to be. Victor Shade arrived on a Thursday afternoon when the light was going flat, and the temperature had dropped enough to put a genuine edge in the air. He came with Warren Holt. Eleanor knew this before she saw either of them because she heard 2 sets of hooves, and she had learned the rhythm of how Caleb arrived home. And this was not it. She was at her desk in the parlor with the volume of territorial law she had been working through, a dense and carefully unhelpful document that rewarded slow reading, and she did not move when she heard Caleb go to the door. She heard the voices, Warren's she recognized. The other one was smooth and precisely calibrated. The voice of a man who was accustomed to entering rooms and having those rooms reorganize themselves around him. "Nathaniel," Warren said, and then corrected immediately. "Caleb. This is Victor Shade. He has been looking at land in the county. I told him your north pasture might interest him." "You told him wrong," Caleb said. Eleanor set down her pen. "Perhaps just a conversation," Shade said. "The particular pleasantness of a man who treated refusals as opening positions. I understand you recently settled a water rights matter. That is actually what brings me out. The North Pasture's water access is what makes it particularly valuable." She stood up. She walked to the doorway of the parlor and stopped there. All three men looked at her. Warren's face did something complicated. Shade's eyes performed the quick inventory she had come to recognize in men who assessed people the way they assessed property, a rapid cataloging followed by a conclusion that was, in her experience, reliably wrong. "Miss Wells," Shade said pleasantly, "I did not realize Mr. Harrow had company. Perhaps Miss Wells would like to step outside while the men talk." "Perhaps Mr. Shade would like to reconsider that suggestion," Eleanor said. "Given that the last man who came to this ranch to discuss Caleb Harrow's water rights left with a significantly revised contract and a clearer understanding of what fine print actually means." Shade's pleasant expression did not change, but something behind it sharpened. She watched him recalibrate, the adjustment of a man who had come expecting a particular room and found different furniture. "Is that so?" he said. "It is," Caleb said. "And the North Pasture is not for sale, now or at any point in the future. You have had a long ride for nothing." "Caleb," Warren started. "Why did you bring him here, Warren?" Caleb's voice had acquired the flatness it got when he had decided something. It was not loud. It did not need to be. "You know this land is not for sale. You know I do not deal with speculators. So why?" Warren looked at Eleanor, then back at Caleb. In the look between those 2 points, Eleanor understood something with the cold clarity of a thing seen without preparation. Warren had brought Shade here not because he believed the land could be purchased. He had brought him here because he had wanted to walk onto this property with another man's money behind him and demonstrate something about diminishment, about who had power and who had lost it. He had wanted Eleanor to see herself through the lens of what she had declined, to understand, by contrast, what she had given up. It had not worked in the way he had planned. Caleb had understood this at the same moment. She could see it in the stillness that came over him, the specific quality of stillness that meant he had arrived at a conclusion, and the conclusion was final. "Get off my property," Caleb said, quietly, completely. Shade went first because Shade was a businessman, and businessmen understood when a room had shifted beyond recovery. Warren went after, with a single look back at Eleanor that contained more than she wanted to receive from him, the specific weight of a man confronting the distance between what he had done and what it had cost. The sound of their horses faded. The desert resumed its indifference. Eleanor turned back to the parlor. She sat down. She picked up the territorial law volume and found her page. Caleb came in a moment later and sat across from her. He did not say anything immediately, and she did not require him to. "Thank you," he said finally, "for not leaving the room." "Did you think I would?" "No." He said it simply. "But I am glad you did not." She looked at him over the top of the book. He looked back at her with that direct and unhurried attention that she had stopped trying to deflect. The afternoon was going gold outside the window, The ranch was quiet around them. Something had shifted again, quietly and without announcing itself, the way things shifted between them now, beneath the surface of lessons and legal documents and practical daily life. Neither of them named it. There was, she thought, a particular kind of courage in that, in the willingness to let something be true without forcing it into language before it was ready. She went back to her page. He picked up his journal. They sat in the parlor while the light changed and the desert did its long, slow work of becoming evening, and the silence between them was the kind that had stopped being empty some time ago and was now, unmistakably, the most honest conversation they had. Augusta Finch arrived on a Friday morning with 2 women from her church circle, both of whom had the look of people who had been invited to witness something and intended to do so thoroughly. She was a broad-shouldered woman of 60 with silver hair and the posture of someone who had spent decades being the fixed point around which a community organized itself. She surveyed the ranch house with the particular expression of a woman looking for evidence to support a conclusion she had already reached. Winifred served tea. Eleanor poured. Caleb sat to Eleanor's left, which he had chosen without consultation, and which Eleanor understood was its own kind of statement. Augusta dispensed with pleasantries in roughly the time it took to settle a teacup. "Miss Marsh," she said, "I will be honest with you. The concern in this community is not about you personally. It is about what happens to the fabric of a place when its conventions are disregarded. When a woman lives under a man's roof without the sanction of marriage, it sends a message to younger women about what is permissible. What message would you prefer they receive?" Eleanor said. Augusta blinked. She had not expected the question to arrive so quickly. "Propriety," she began. "Respect for—" "The message I would like them to receive," Eleanor said, "is that a woman's mind is worth as much as anything else she brings into a household. That a woman who knows things is not a problem to be managed. That being sent away for being too educated is the shameful part of that story, not the part where she found somewhere to put her knowledge to use." She set down her cup. "I was returned, Mrs. Finch, like a letter addressed incorrectly." And the town talked. And no one came to Warren Holt's door to suggest he had behaved badly. That was the irregular arrangement. I did not hear it called that. One of the women from the church circle shifted in her chair. Augusta's forward momentum had lost some of its certainty. "That is a different matter," she said. "Is it?" Caleb said. He said it so quietly that everyone in the room looked at him. He had not spoken since they arrived. He looked at Augusta Finch with the level, unhurried attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. "My teacher," he said, "is the reason I can read the contracts that run this ranch. She is the reason a man from the land office left here last month with a corrected document instead of leaving with my water rights. She is the reason I know what I am signing when I put my name to something." He held Augusta's gaze. "She makes this ranch better. She makes me better. And I would ask you to extend to her the same basic respect you would extend to any man who came here and did honest work." Augusta Finch was not a woman who was easily silenced. She was quiet for a moment that was longer than her usual ones. Then she said, more carefully, "The arrangement. Will it continue as it is?" Caleb looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Caleb. "No," Caleb said. "It will not." Augusta's eyebrows moved. "It will change," Caleb said, "in the way that I intend to ask Miss Marsh, when she is ready, whether she will marry me. The answer to that is entirely her business and mine. But I wanted you to hear it from me directly. so that what travels through the church circle is at least accurate. The room rearranged itself around the thing he had said. One of the church women had her teacup suspended halfway to her mouth and appeared to have forgotten about it. Augusta Finch looked at Caleb and then at Eleanor and then back again. And something moved through her face that was not the expression she had come in wearing, not warm, not converted, but shifted in the way of a woman who had come with a prepared position and found the ground beneath it somewhat different from her maps. "Well," Augusta said at last. "Well," Eleanor agreed. After they left, Eleanor sat on the front porch in the cooling afternoon and said nothing. Caleb sat beside her. He did not fill the silence. This was, she had come to understand, one of the things about him that was not a small thing. He never filled silence simply because it was there. After a while, she said, "You told her you intended to ask me." "I told her my intention," he said, "not the outcome." He paused. "I do not know the outcome." She looked at her hands in her lap. "You said when she is ready," she said. "Yes. How will you know?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, in the voice he used for things that were precisely true, "I was hoping you would tell me." She looked at the desert. The sky was doing the thing it did in October, going colors that had no names in the vocabulary of the places she had come from. She thought about a woman who had come to this territory with 43 books and no plan beyond survival. She thought about what it meant that survival had turned into something else, quietly and without permission, in a kitchen with a primer and a man who had needed to learn his own name. "Ask me on a Sunday," she said. He looked at her. "Why Sunday?" "Because it is the only day neither of us is working." She kept her eyes on the horizon. "And I would like to be asked when we have time to sit with the answer." A silence. Then, with the unhurried weight of a man arriving at a decision that had already been made. "Sunday," he said. "All right." The light went on changing. Neither of them moved. The ranch settled around them into the long quiet of the evening, and somewhere out past the south pasture, the first coyote of the night tested the dark with its brief inquiring sound, and the desert, as always, absorbed it without comment. The letter from Tucson arrived on a Saturday. It came with a writer who said it was urgent and who stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and waited for a response, which told Eleanor, before she had read a word of it, that someone had paid extra to make sure it was received and acknowledged. Caleb took the letter. He stood in the doorway with the afternoon light behind him and read it in the careful, complete way he read everything that mattered now. Each section given its full attention. Nothing skipped, nothing assumed. She watched his face while he read. She had learned to read his face the way she read difficult texts, not for the surface expression, but for what moved underneath it, the small adjustments of jaw and brow that indicated what the words were doing to him. He went very still partway through the second page, the kind of still that was not calm. He finished reading. He held the letter for a moment without moving. Then he handed it to Eleanor without a word. She read it. It was from the land office in Tucson, but not from Aldous Crane. It came from a man named Harlan Moss, whose title was Regional Superintendent, and whose name Eleanor had seen once in the Territorial Law volume, in connection with 3 prior water rights disputes in the county. The letter was formal and precise and communicated in the measured language of official correspondence that a complaint had been filed against Caleb Harrow by Victor Shade, alleging that Caleb had fraudulently misrepresented his literacy during the water rights negotiation in order to induce Crane into signing a revised contract that was, according to Shade's complaint, obtained through deliberate deception and therefore not legally binding. Eleanor read it through once quickly. Then she read it again slowly. The claim was constructed from nothing. There was no deception. Caleb had learned to read, which was not a fraud perpetrated on anyone but a fact about a man who had decided to change something about his life. The revised contract was a correction of language that had itself been deceptive. Anyone who examined the original and the revision with honest eyes would understand this immediately. But the complaint had been filed by Victor Shade, represented by the law offices of Mercer and Hall. Eleanor crossed to the bookshelf and took down the territorial law volume she had been working through for the past 3 weeks. She found the section she needed and read it again, faster now, her eyes moving with the urgency of someone confirming a pattern they had already half recognized. Mercer and Hall had represented the land office in 3 prior water rights cases in the territory. All 3 had been decided in the office's favor. In 2 of those 3 cases, the original landowner had sold within a year of the ruling. The sales had occurred at prices that the county records described as fair market value. Eleanor had learned enough about how such things worked to understand that fair market value and actual value were not always the same number, and that the difference between them tended to benefit the people who had decided what fair meant. She set the volume on the table and turned it to face Caleb. "Look at this," she said. 3 cases. Same firm. Same outcome. She pointed to the relevant passage. "He did not come here to buy the land. He came here to see if he could move you off it." Caleb read the passage. She could see his eyes moving with the focused deliberateness of a man who had been practicing this exact skill for weeks and was now using it for the precise purpose it had been built for. When he finished, he looked up. "He figured I could not fight it," Caleb said. "He figured you would not know how." Eleanor kept her voice level. 3 months ago, he would have been right. The weight of that settled between them, not comfortably. It was not the kind of thing that settled comfortably. It was the kind of thing that sat in a room and reminded everyone present of how close certain disasters come without announcing themselves. "What do we do?" Caleb said. "We write a response tonight," Eleanor said. "We cite the relevant territorial statutes. We document the original negotiation and the specific language that was corrected and why. We include a certified copy of the revised contract." She paused. "And then you need a lawyer in Tucson. Someone who knows Moss and knows how Mercer and Hall operates. I do not know any lawyers in Tucson. Reverend Cole does. He mentioned it to me when he came to the ranch last month. He said he had referred parishioners to a man named Edmund Whitfield who was honest and not expensive." She met Caleb's eyes. "Send word tonight. Call in whatever standing you have with the Reverend." Caleb nodded once. Then he went to find pen and paper. Eleanor opened the territorial law volume to the first relevant statute and began building their argument. She worked the way she had always worked when something needed to be done correctly, with the forward-leaning concentration of a woman who understood that the difference between a good argument and a poor one was precision, and that precision was not a matter of intelligence, but of care, of being willing to stay with the difficult part long enough for it to become clear. She made notes. She identified the statutes that directly contradicted Shade's claim. She drafted language that said what needed to be said without saying more than necessary, because in legal documents, as in most things, excess created openings. Caleb came back with paper and sat down beside her. They worked together for 2 hours. He read the statutes she pointed to, slowly and completely, and when he did not understand a phrase, he said so, and she explained it, and then he read it again. When she drafted a paragraph, he read it back and twice suggested changes that were, both times, correct. The second time he suggested a change, she stopped writing and looked at him. "You are right," she said. "That paragraph is defensive. We are not defending. We are stating facts." He looked at the draft. "Yes, those are different things." She rewrote the paragraph. He read it again. "Better," he said. "Not arrogant. Simply accurate." Winifred came through at some point and left a plate of bread and cold meat on the corner of the table without comment, which was Winifred's way of saying she understood what was happening and considered it worth sustaining. Eleanor ate without tasting anything. Caleb ate without stopping work. At 9:30, Eleanor said, "Go to bed. I will finish the draft." He looked at her. "You have been working since before breakfast," she said. "I work best alone at this stage anyway. I need to read it through several times, and you will be more useful tomorrow with clear eyes." He considered this with the practical honesty of a man who knew his own limits. Then he said, "Leave it on the table. I want to read the final version before it goes out." She nodded. He gathered his coat and went to the door. Then he stopped. "Eleanor," he said. She looked up. "Whatever the outcome of this is." He paused. "I want you to know that the ranch aside, what you have given me this autumn is not something I can account for in any currency I have." He looked at her steadily. "I could not read my own name 3 months ago. I can read that letter from Tucson. I can find the places where it is wrong, and I know why they are wrong." He stopped. "I am aware that those two facts are connected, and I am aware of why." Eleanor set down her pen. She looked at this man who had stood at a train station and asked a stranger if she could read, who had sat across a kitchen table and written the alphabet 5 times before being asked to, who had turned a page face down on a table because something about seeing his own name written for the first time had moved through him in a way he had not known how to hold in public. "What you have done," she said carefully, "is learn. I provided materials. You did the work." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he went to bed. She finished the draft at 11 o'clock and left it on the table. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and did not immediately lie down. She sat with a particular quality of tiredness that was not only physical, the tiredness of a woman who had been holding things carefully for a long time and was beginning to feel the weight of the holding. She thought about the letter from Tucson. She thought about Victor Shade filing a complaint designed to cost more to fight than to settle, designed to function not as a legal argument, but as a financial siege. She thought about what that strategy relied on. A man who would not know how to answer it, who would look at legal language and see only obstacle rather than argument, who would eventually calculate that selling was easier than fighting. She thought about a version of this story in which Caleb Harrow had not been standing on the platform in September when she arrived, in which no one had made that particular offer on that particular afternoon, in which he had met Crane and signed what Crane put in front of him, and then met Shade's complaint with the helplessness of a man fighting in a language he had never been given. She thought about that version for a while. It was not comfortable to think about. Then she reached for her traveling bag and found, in the inside pocket where she had put it 3 weeks ago and not taken it out, the letter from her cousin Eleanor in Philadelphia. She had read it once when it arrived and set it aside, which she had told herself was not avoidance, but simply a matter of prioritizing more urgent correspondence. She held it now in the dark room, with the desert making its low sounds outside the window, and she was honest with herself, in the way she was honest with herself when there was no one present to perform certainty for. The letter offered her a room in a house with lace curtains on the windows, a position at a school in Philadelphia, a return to respectability, which was the word her cousin had used, a word that meant safety dressed in better clothes. Her cousin was not unkind. The offer was not unkind. It was the offer of someone who looked at Eleanor's situation and saw exposure and wanted to help her find cover. Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about the school in Philadelphia, the careful social calibrations of women who had decided which version of themselves was permissible and had been trimming to fit that version ever since. She thought about what it would mean to go there now, to explain herself, to accept the particular grammar of a woman who had tried something unconventional and come back appropriately chastened. She thought about starting over again, smaller, in a space that had already decided how much room she was allowed. She thought about a sentence written in an uneven hand at the bottom of a journal page. A man can build everything he has with his own hands and still not know what he is missing until it walks up to find him at the train station. She put the letter back in the bag. She lay down on the bed and looked at the ceiling and said to herself, with the directness she reserved for the thing she was most afraid to say, "You are not going to Philadelphia. You were not going to Philadelphia when you put that letter in your bag, and you are not going now. The question is not whether you are leaving. The question is what you are staying for. And the answer to that," she told herself with the same directness, "was not only Caleb Harrow, though Caleb Harrow was not a small part of it. The answer was this: the work of the past 3 months, the legal documents and the practice sentences, and Delia at the kitchen table with her determined frown, and the water rights contract that said what it was supposed to say. The answer was that she had come west looking for a life and had found one, and it was not the life she had imagined in any particular, and it was more than she had known to want. She was not going backward. The morning came clear and cold, the particular cold of an Arizona November morning that had real intent behind it, not the performative chill of September. Eleanor came to the kitchen to find the draft she had left on the table, sitting beside Caleb's coffee cup with a small mark in the margin next to the third paragraph, a single line that indicated he had read it and found one place to question. She read his note. The question was correct. She revised the paragraph over breakfast, and when he came in from the morning check, she showed him the revision. He read it, nodded. "That is better," he said. He looked at her across the coffee cups and the corrected pages. "Did you sleep?" "Enough," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the particular attention that had stopped pretending to be something other than what it was. Then he picked up the draft and read it through one more time, completely, the way he read everything that mattered. When he finished, he set it down. "I am going to write to Whitfield myself," he said. Eleanor looked up. "I will write it tonight." He met her eyes. "I want him to know who he is working with." She understood what he meant. Not the practical matter of the letter. The other thing, the man who could now write that letter, who could draft it in his own language and sign it with his own name and mean both of those things in ways he could not have meant them in September. "I will read it before it goes," she said. He nodded. That evening she was in the parlor reading when she heard the pen moving in the kitchen, the careful, deliberate sound of a man writing something he was thinking about, word by word. She did not go in. She sat with her book and listened to the small industry of it and felt something move through her chest that she had no precise name for and had stopped trying to name. At 9:30, he appeared in the parlor doorway. "Tell me if there is anything wrong with this," he said. She took the letter. She read it. It was not legally sophisticated. It did not use the formal language of the courtroom or the precise vocabulary of territorial statute. It was the letter of a man who had learned to write 3 months ago and was using that ability to say something that needed to be said, in plain language that could not be misread and left no room for interpretation. It said what had happened. It said it clearly. It said it in the voice of someone who knew the difference between what he had been told and what the papers had said, and who understood now why that difference had existed. And it was signed in handwriting that had become over the autumn unmistakably and recognizably his, Caleb Harrow. Not a mark, a name, the full weight of a man who had decided to be legible to the world. "There is nothing wrong with it," Eleanor said. He stood in the doorway looking at her. She held the letter a moment longer and then said, "There is something I want to tell you." He waited. He was very good at waiting. "I received a letter from my cousin in Philadelphia 3 weeks ago," she said. She set his letter carefully on the table beside her, offering me a position, a room, a way back to something conventional. He was still. "I have been carrying it around in my bag," she said. She looked at him directly. "I am telling you now because I think you should know, and because I want you to know that I put it back in the bag the same night I took it out." She paused. "I am not going to Philadelphia, Caleb." The silence after that had a different quality from the ones that had preceded it. It was not empty and it was not heavy. It was the silence of a room in which something important had just been said and was still in the process of being absorbed. He exhaled, once short, controlled. The release of a man who had been holding something and had just been told he could put it down. "You told Winifred before you told me," he said. "Winifred was in the room when I decided." The corner of his mouth moved. "You decided in front of Winifred. She was convenient," Eleanor said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Eleanor, I need to ask you something directly." She met his eyes. "You have never had difficulty with that?" "No." He held her gaze. "Is there any version of a future you can imagine where you stay here? Not as my teacher, not as my employee. Something more than that." The parlor was very quiet. Outside, the night was doing what Arizona nights did in November, pressing in close and cold and full of stars too numerous to count, the kind of sky that made the problems of the human world seem appropriately sized. "Yes," she said, "there is." He let out a breath she had not known he was holding. The kind of breath a man releases when he has been carrying something significant for longer than he has admitted. "Then I would like to court you properly," he said. "Not because of Reverend Cole or Augusta Finch or unsigned letters. Because I want to, and because you deserve to be chosen by someone who understands exactly what he is choosing." He looked at her steadily. "I am not Warren Holt. I know that," she said. "Then trust what you have seen," he said, "not what you are afraid of." She pressed her fingertips to the arm of the chair. She breathed. She thought about a woman on a train platform 3 months ago with a trunk full of books and nowhere particular to go, and she thought about this woman here now, in a parlor in Arizona, with a legal draft on the table, and a man in the doorway who had learned to write his own name and use that ability, tonight, to fight for something worth fighting for. She did not answer him. Not yet. But she did not look away either. And between the two of them, in the particular grammar they had developed over 3 months of lessons and silence and things said plainly in plain rooms, That was already a kind of answer. The letter to Whitfield went out the following morning. Reverend Cole, when Caleb sent word, responded within 2 hours with Whitfield's address in Tucson and a brief personal note that said simply, "I am glad you are fighting this." Caleb read the note himself and set it on the table without comment, but Eleanor saw him read it twice. She was at her desk that afternoon when she heard the pen moving in the kitchen again. Not the careful, deliberate pace of a man writing something new. The faster, more settled sound of someone writing something he already knows. She looked in through the open doorway. Caleb was at the kitchen table with his journal open, writing in the evening light. He was not laboring over the letters. He was simply writing, the way a person writes when the words and the hand have come to an understanding with each other. She did not interrupt him. She went back to her desk and sat down and looked at the window and the cold Arizona sky beyond it. And she thought about Sunday, which was the day after tomorrow, and about what it meant to be asked something when there was time to sit with the answer. She thought she was ready. She thought she had been ready for some time, and had been waiting, not for readiness, but for the particular kind of courage that was not the absence of fear, but the decision that the thing on the other side of fear was worth the crossing. She picked up her pen and went back to work, and the sound of two people writing in separate rooms of the same house filled the quiet of the late afternoon, and the ranch held them both in its ordinary way, as though this were simply what happened here, which, she thought, it was. Sunday came in quietly, not with the fanfare of a significant day, but with the ordinary, unhurried arrival of a morning that had decided not to announce itself. Pale light at the window before dawn, the desert cooling into the blue hour before the sun committed, a single bird somewhere past the south pasture, making its brief inquiry and receiving no answer. Eleanor was awake before the light had fully decided what it intended to be. She lay still for a while in the east room and listened to the ranch settle around her, the particular sounds of a place that had become, over the course of 3 months, familiar in the way that only happens when you have stopped being a guest and become, without ceremony, something else. She knew the sound the second board made in the hallway. She knew the way the wind came through the gap at the west window. She knew which sounds were the house and which were Caleb, moving in the early hours through the tasks that did not wait for daylight. She got up. She washed her face at the basin with water that had gone cold overnight. She put on the dark blue wool dress, the one she had pressed carefully in Boston before she left, and had worn precisely twice since arriving in Red Canyon. Once at the dry goods store, when she had wanted to make a particular impression, and once at no occasion at all, simply because she had wanted to wear something that was not practical. She went to the kitchen and started the coffee and sat down and put her hands around the empty cup and did not reach for a book. This was unusual enough that she noticed it. She was a woman who read during waiting. She organized, annotated, prepared the next task. Sitting with empty hands and an empty cup in a quiet kitchen was not something she did naturally or often. This morning, she did it. Some mornings deserved to be met without armor. Caleb came in from the yard at first light, still wearing his coat, bringing the cold of the morning in with him. He stopped when he saw her at the table. She watched his eyes move to the blue dress and then back to her face. "You are up early," he said. "So are you," she said. He poured his coffee. He sat down across from her. He looked at her with the directness that had stopped being something she needed to prepare for and had become, without her noticing the transition, something she depended on, the simple, reliable fact of a man who looked at her and saw what was actually there. "Eleanor Marsh," he said. "Caleb Harrow," she said. "I have been thinking about how to say this for 2 weeks." He set down his cup. He folded his hands on the table. "I have decided the most honest thing I can do is say it plainly, because you have had enough of men who dress things up to sound like something they are not." She waited. "I love you," he said. "I love the way your mind works, and the way you do not soften things that should not be softened." He paused. "I love that you corrected my arithmetic the first time we met and did not apologize for it. I love that you stood in that doorway when shade came and did not move." He looked at her steadily. "I love that you wrote a letter to Augusta Finch and did not tell me until it was already sent." Eleanor looked at her hands around the cup. "I love that you put the Philadelphia letter back in your bag," he said, "and that you told me about it anyway." Another pause, the kind he used when he was arriving at the most important thing. "I would like to spend the rest of my life being taught things by you, if you will have me." The kitchen was completely still. The coffee was going warm between them. Through the window, the desert was doing its morning work, the light finding the edges of things and making them precise, the way good light did. Eleanor looked at this man who had written his name for the first time on a Tuesday in September, and wept a little with his face turned away and thought she had not noticed. This man who had placed a green shawl over her shoulders in the middle of the night and said exactly one sentence about it, and trusted that one sentence to carry everything it needed to carry. This man who had written a letter to a lawyer in Tucson in his own words and signed it with his own name because he had decided that the world should know who it was dealing with. She felt the last careful wall inside her chest come down. Not dramatically, not with the violence of a thing that breaks, with the quiet of a thing that has been leaning for a long time and finally, in the right conditions, allows itself to rest. "Yes," she said, "I will have you." He exhaled. She heard it. The long, controlled release of a man who had been holding something significant for longer than he had acknowledged. The particular sound of someone putting down a weight they had told themselves was not heavy. "That is all," he said. "That is everything," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His palm was rough from 11 years of work, warm against her cold fingers, and they sat like that in the early morning kitchen with the coffee going warm between them and the desert light coming in the window, and neither of them needed to say anything more, because everything that needed saying had been said, and everything that had not been said was understood. It was enough. It was more than enough. The letter from Edmund Whitfield arrived on Monday. He had reviewed both the complaint and their response, and his assessment, delivered in the brisk, precise language of a man who did not spend words unnecessarily, was that Shade's claim was without legal merit. Harlan Moss at the land office had reviewed the certified copy of the revised contract and the relevant territorial statutes and had moved to dismiss the complaint. The case was closed before it had properly begun. At the bottom of the letter, in language slightly warmer than the rest of it, Whitfield had written, "Your response was unusually well constructed for a document drafted without legal counsel. I commend whoever assisted you." Caleb read this aloud at the kitchen table. Then he looked at Eleanor. "He thinks you wrote it," he said. "We wrote it," she said. "You changed the third paragraph. I am going to write back and tell him I drafted it myself," Caleb said. Eleanor looked at him. "Because I did," he said, "mostly, and because in 6 months I will be able to do it entirely on my own. And I want Whitfield to know who he is dealing with." He held her gaze with that level certainty that was the most characteristic thing about him. Not stubbornness, not performance, but the quiet confidence of a man who knew what he was building and intended to build it all the way. "Is that all right?" "It is more than all right," she said. They married in December, when the desert had pulled back from the worst of the cold, and the mornings had the particular clarity of a season that had decided to be honest about itself. Reverend Thaddeus Cole officiated with the tired warmth of a man who had married many people, and had learned to tell, by the way they stood, which ones would hold. Winifred Briggs wore her good hat and cried into a handkerchief with the fierce privacy of a woman who would deny the crying if asked, and whose face, when she composed it, had the look of someone whose read of things had been confirmed in the most satisfying possible way. Harriet Webb came from the lending shelf and brought 3 books as a wedding gift, which Eleanor found more moving than any silver could have been. Augusta Finch came without being invited and sat in the 3rd row with her silver hair and her correct posture, and when Eleanor caught her eye before the ceremony began, Augusta gave a single nod. Not warm, not effusive, simply real, the nod of a woman who had revised a position and was willing to demonstrate it in public, which was, Eleanor thought, more than many people ever managed. Warren Holt did not come. Eleanor had not expected him to. She found she did not mind. Some things resolved themselves not through confrontation or reconciliation, but through time simply moving forward and carrying people to different places, and Warren Holt was somewhere on the other side of that movement, and she wished him nothing unkind. When Reverend Cole asked Caleb if he took this woman, Caleb said "I do" with the same unhurried certainty he brought to everything that was true. When he asked Eleanor, she said "I do," and meant it in every part of herself, simultaneously, the practical part and the hopeful part, and the part that had very nearly stopped hoping, all of them in agreement for the first time in longer than she could remember. Caleb signed the marriage certificate in the handwriting that was now fully and unmistakably his. Winifred placed the old contract beside the certificate without ceremony, the one with the X where his name should have been. She let it sit for a moment. Then she took it away. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. Eleanor signed beneath his name, Eleanor Marsh Harrow. She had kept Marsh. She looked at it for a moment. "I kept Marsh," she said. "I should tell you." "I know," Caleb said. "I read the certificate before I signed it." She laughed. A real one, the kind she gave more freely now, and he smiled, and Reverend Cole cleared his throat with mild patience and told them they were married if they would like to proceed to that part. The school opened on the 14th of January, 1884, which was 14 months after Eleanor Marsh had arrived at the Red Canyon station with a trunk of books and a train not leaving until morning. It opened with 22 students, which was 10 more than the Territorial Board of Education had projected, and which required Eleanor to send to Tucson for additional primers before the end of the first week. Delia sat in the front row with the particular expression of a child who has been waiting for something and has finally been given permission to want it openly. The rancher's boy from the Coleridge spread sat in the back with the defensive posture of someone who had been told school was for younger children and was not entirely persuaded otherwise. 2 siblings from a family Eleanor had not yet met sat together in the middle and held hands under the desk, which she pretended not to notice. She stood at the front of that single room with the stove that needed replacing and the window that let in a draft and 22 faces looking at her. And she felt something she had not felt since Boston. Not relief. Not the careful gratitude of a woman who has survived something difficult and arrived at something tolerable. Something more complete than that. She felt exactly like herself. Augusta Finch's granddaughter was in the third row. Eleanor had not known to expect this and said nothing about it, giving the girl the same attention she gave every other child in the room. At the end of the day, when the others had gone and the girl was gathering her things with the lingering deliberateness of someone who has something to say and has not yet found the words, she said, "My grandmother says you are very smart." Eleanor said, "Your grandmother is very perceptive." She sent the girl home. That evening, Caleb asked how the first day had gone. 22 students, Eleanor said. 3 of them could already read. 12 had never held a pencil. One of them informed me that girls do not need mathematics. "What did you tell him?" Caleb said. "I told him the woman who keeps the accounts for the Harrow ranch would be interested to hear that opinion and suggested he raise it with her directly." Eleanor paused. "I did not tell him who the woman was." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully, "Did you tell him yet?" "Not yet," she said. "I am saving it." He laughed, genuinely, fully, the laugh of a man who had been loosening by degrees since the October evening on the porch, and was now, in his own kitchen with his wife across the table, completely himself. Eleanor had not told him yet that it was one of her favorite sounds. She was saving that as well. Warren Holt came to the school in March. He came on a Thursday afternoon when the children had gone home and Eleanor was alone at her desk marking the week's work. He knocked on the open door and waited in the way of a man who understood he was not owed an easy reception. She looked up. She had not spoken to him since the evening he had ridden up with Victor Shade, and she had not sought the conversation in the months since, had simply let the distance be what it needed to be. "Abigail," he said. Then he stopped and corrected himself. "Miss Marsh." He stepped inside, hat in hand. "Mrs. Harrow." "Eleanor," she said. He looked around the schoolroom with the expression of a man who had come prepared for something and found the preparation insufficient. "I heard about the school," he said. "Most people have. I came to say something I have been trying to say since October." He met her eyes. "I was wrong about you." He said it plainly, in the voice of a man for whom the admission was genuinely difficult, and who was doing it anyway, because it was correct. "I was afraid of what you were. I called it principle. It was fear." Eleanor looked at him. She examined what she felt and found it uncomplicated. Not anger, not the residue of old hurt, simply the clear, mild regard of a woman looking at a person who belonged to her past and had very little to do with her present. "Thank you, Warren," she said. "That is honestly said." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face had the quality of a man who has finally put down a stone he has been carrying for a long time and is surprised by how much lighter the air is without it. "He is a good man," Warren said. "Caleb." "He is an excellent man," Eleanor said, "and a very good reader." Warren almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that she could see the shape of it. The beginning of a man becoming someone slightly better than he had been, which was, she thought, the most any of us could reasonably ask of the time we were given. He put his hat on. He nodded once. He left. Eleanor sat for a moment in the empty schoolroom, in the particular quality of quiet that classrooms held after children had gone. the warm residue of noise and energy settling into something still. She thought about the woman who had sat on a platform bench in September with nowhere to go. She thought about this woman here now, in a schoolroom she had opened, in a life she had not planned and could not have imagined, and would not have traded for anything that Boston or Philadelphia or the version of herself who had answered a mail order. Advertisement had ever managed to dream up. She picked up her pen. She went back to her marking. Outside, the desert was doing what it always did, being enormous, being indifferent, being, in its own austere and unhurried way, exactly what it was. She had learned, over the course of a year in Red Canyon, to find that not threatening, but companionable. The desert did not require you to be anything other than what you were. It simply continued, and you continued alongside it. And if you were paying attention, if you were honest and stubborn and willing to stay when staying was difficult, you found that the life you built in the space it offered was large enough to hold all of you. Every part. The education and the stubbornness and the love she had very nearly talked herself out of. All of it. Finally, completely, held